happy to say we're seeing some of you for the second time today, and that's great. Last year we invited Michael Barnhart here to talk about World War I. Some of you were here for that, and we thought he was wonderful, and we asked him what else he could talk about. And he said, how about World War II? So here we are tonight. Michael Barnhart is a distinguished teaching professor of history at Stony Brook, where he's taught since receiving his doctorate from Harvard University in 1980. He's written over 24 scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as 2 books, including Japan Prepares for Total War, The Search for Economic Security from 1919 to 1941, which was recently translated into Korean. His current project is a 2-volume survey titled E Pluribus Unum. No, E Pluribus, I'm sorry. A Political History of American Foreign Relations from Jamestown to Obama. Please welcome Michael Barnhart.
Well, I'd first like to thank Penny Wright and her colleagues here at the library for inviting me back, and all of you for coming this evening. I do recognize a few faces. Those of you who might remember what I had to say about the First World War, I emphasized that most of the policy decisions that led to American entry into that war were not made in Washington, they were made in Berlin. This evening, I'm going to be emphasizing the fact that most of the policy decisions that led to American entry into the Second World War were also not made in Washington, they were made in Tokyo. I can assure you that if I'm invited back to talk about American entry into the Third World War, I can positively guarantee that the policy decisions for that one will have been made in Washington. So we'll see about that. When we look at American entry into the Second World War, as I say, the most important thing to understand is the Japanese environment. After all, it wasn't the Americans that attacked Tokyo that brought the United States into the war. It was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and that's what I'd like to kind of build up my talk to. And there are a number of background factors that have to do with how the Japanese government made its decisions, those policy decisions that were crucial to understanding how the Japanese could do something that, even to a lot of Americans at the time, seemed so colossally stupid. That is, to bring the United States into the war at a time when, nostalgia, the American economy was 10 times that of Japan. Not anymore, but back in the 1940s. How in the world could the Japanese have done such a crazy thing to risk war with the United States? That's one of the aims of my talk tonight. And to answer the question, how could the Japanese have done such a seemingly illogical thing, we have to take a look at the logic of the Japanese decision-making process. And I'm not going to go into detail. This is not a full-blown semestral course on the modern history of Japan, but there are some factors that we have to bear in mind. And the first of those was the Japanese Constitution. It was a good deal more recent than the American Constitution. It had been drawn up in 1889 by a new Japanese government that had thrown off the old Tokugawa shogunate. What's interesting about that Japanese Constitution, well, there are a lot of things interesting, but what's interesting for our purpose tonight was the provisions that were written into it for who had the right of supreme command. For the American Constitution, well, it's really quite clear about that. Congress decides whether to declare war or not. Once war is declared, it's all in the president's hands. The president says, the military obeys. It's as simple as that. But in the Japanese Constitution, it's not as simple as that. Because the Japanese had to justify their new government, their new regime, by seeming to vest all power in the Japanese emperor. But they knew that the Japanese emperor, who had not held real policy-making power for over 800 years, was not in a position to make real policy decisions in 1889 or thereafter. So the right of supreme command was actually vested in the Imperial Japanese Army and Imperial Japanese Navy that would act in the name of the emperor. Well, this was a perfectly logical arrangement, but as we'll see in just a few moments, it led to some perfectly illogical problems for the Japanese. But that's one thing I want you to hold in your mind, that the Japanese right of supreme command, who makes the final call, in Japanese foreign and defense policy decisions is a shared responsibility between the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy. The second background factor that I think you have to bear in mind is the Japanese experience during the First World War. Now remember, Japan was on our side in that war. Japan had long been allied with Great Britain. Japan entered the First World War well before the United States did, and entered it at Britain's request. Japan was therefore a victorious power at the end of the First World War, but it sure didn't seem that way to the members of the Imperial Army and Imperial Navy. They were terrified by the outcome of the First World War. Well, obvious question, why? Well, harking back to that Meiji Constitution, when the Japanese had drawn up their constitution, when they had formulated their completely new government, to get rid of the old feudal government that they had replaced, they decided to do a very logical thing. They decided to study the world. They sent scholars, students all around the world to see who's got the best system of laws. We'll copy that one. Who's got the best navy? We'll copy that one. Who's got the best army? We'll copy that one. We'll use that as a pattern. And since we're only interested tonight in Pearl Harbor, the only institutions we're really interested in are who did the Imperial Army and Imperial Navy copy? Well, the Imperial Navy, that was a no-brainer. They copied Great Britain. The British had by far the best navy of the 19th century and well into the 20th. And it seemed to be a no-brainer too for the Japanese Army. Germany had the best army in Europe for much of the 19th into the 20th century. And that was the problem because Germany lost the war. So the Imperial Army in particular was deeply disturbed. Did we copy the wrong army? Did we get it wrong? That's a fundamental problem. And they sent their best experts, both during and immediately after the First World War, to answer that question. Did we copy the wrong army? Has the German army lost it? And they came back with an answer that was both reassuring and alarming at the same time. It was reassuring in the sense that the Japanese army officers reported we did not copy the wrong army. Pound for pound, soldier for soldier, rifle for rifle, artillery piece for artillery piece, Germany had the best army in the First World War. Reassuring. We copied the right army. Alarming. Well then, why did Germany lose the war? Well, Germany lost the war not because it had a lousy army, but because the British blockade deprived that army of necessary resources to fight a modern industrial war. Germany literally ran out of food. Germany ran out of oil. Germany ran out of iron ore and the various alloys you need to make steel. Well, that was pretty alarming for the Japanese because Japan, of all the great powers after the First World War, was the least self-sufficient in any of those things. And so the Japanese army determined very quickly on it was going to have to do two things. It was going to have to build up an industrial base sufficient to wage a modern industrial war if Japan was going to be capable of defending itself. But even more needfully, Japan was going to have to acquire a resource base. It was going to have to get the oil. It was going to have to get the iron ore mines and so forth. And Japan didn't have those in the home islands. Well, that was, to many Army officers, a multi-generational thing. But to have it be that long was not an acceptable answer. In the interim, Japan would not be able to protect itself. And Japan, after all, had gone through that revolution precisely to ensure that it was, and indeed it was, the only Asian nation that resisted Western colonialism and imperialism. Japan couldn't wait. One of the products of that determination, you got to acquire a resource base, was Japanese territorial encroachment into China. China didn't have everything that Japan needed, but it had some things that Japan required, such as iron ore, for example. The Imperial Army had never been completely comfortable with that. There was a strong debate inside the Army over how aggressively to pursue territorial encroachment into China. The debates essentially revolved around a couple of issues. That the cautious Army officers said, well, we don't want to go too far, too fast, because China is under the protection of the Western powers, and the American public in particular have kind of a soft spot in their hearts for the Chinese, which was quite true. There were widespread American missionary activities in China. There was extensive scientific and other assistance in connection to China. Most of the American public did have a soft spot in their hearts, and one that was built upon by American literature, such as Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, best-selling novel of the 1930s, was made into a movie, very popular in the 1930s. So the Imperial Army officers knew we press too hard, we're going to alienate the United States, and that's a big deal because we get most of our oil from America. On the other hand, there were other Imperial Army officers that said we can't afford to wait. The longer we wait, the longer we're unprotected against any other power that wishes to move against us. These debates were solved quite acrimoniously because, after all, the right of supreme command was invested in the Imperial Army and Imperial Navy. And if the Imperial Army disagrees among itself, who's to decide? There is no president, there is no commander-in-chief to adjudicate this disagreement. To make a long story short, the initial disagreement was adjudicated by a duel, in which only one guy had a sword. So it was over pretty quickly, and it was the impetuous officers who literally killed the leader of the cautious officer group and decided to press on. The result of that policy was a skirmish outside of Marco Polo Bridge in the summer of 1937 that quickly blossomed into a full-scale war between Japan and China, with the cautious Army officers saying, "See, we told you so." No good was going to come of this, and no good did. Because for the next several years, 1937, 1938, 1939, Japanese defense policy was overwhelmingly dominated by the question of how do we get out of China? How do we solve the Chinese war? And of course, most military officers, being military officers, translated that into how do we win the war against China? And the Japanese Army groped for one solution after another during these years. One was to march on the Chinese capital of, back then in those days, the southern capital of Nanking, and to terrorize it. The rape of Nanking, the Nanking incident, the Nanking massacre, all those names were used, and they all apply to it. It was the deliberate use of what we nowadays would call state-sponsored terrorism to induce the Chinese regime to sue for peace. It failed. Another attempt was to try negotiations with the Chinese regime. That failed. Another attempt was to create a rival Chinese regime. That failed. A final attempt in 1939 was to seek an alliance with Germany, but it turned out that the Germans were far more interested in the non-aggression pact of the Soviet Union, an arch rival to the Japanese. That failed too. By the start of 1940, therefore, the Japanese found themselves in an impossible position. The longer their war with China went on, the more strained the relations with the United States became. Already by 1940, some private American citizens had organized a movement to boycott Japanese goods, the chief one of which, by the way, was silk, back then used in gentlemen's neckties and ladies' stockings. But you could show your patriotism by, patriot, tie in that regard. The Japanese followed this quite carefully and said, well, we're not in trouble yet, but it's only a matter of time before the American government might commence economic pressure against us, and then we're in big trouble because our very war against China has drained us of oil reserves, of our available steel reserves. They took to things like trying to buy scrap iron from the United States, the L, for any of you who remember the old transit system back in the city. The Japanese do that not because they're planning deliberate aggression against the United States in the future. They're doing it because they're desperate for the scrap iron to fight their war against China in 1938, 1939, and 1940. But they know we can't continue this game for long. We've got to find some kind of solution, some kind of resolution to our problem. The outbreak of the war caused by Germany's invasion of Poland just made a bad situation worse, so far as the Japanese were concerned. Because once Europe was at war, all of those war-related goods, iron ore, oil, finished steel, optical quartz, you name it, anything that could be used by modern military, that the Japanese had relied upon purchasing from the West, now the West needed for its own war. And although the United States was not yet engaged in the European conflict, American companies and the American government were far more willing and far more eager to sell all of those materials to the British and the French, not to the Japanese. So the Japanese found it much more difficult to acquire their needed industrial materials, and even when they could, they were far more expensive than they had been before the outbreak of that war. So the picture that I want to paint is of an increasingly desperate Japan at the start of 1940 that doesn't see a way out of its war with China. But then comes a miracle. Then comes what the Japanese phrase is an opportunity that comes only once every 10,000 years. They had last used it in 1914 when the First World War had broken out, so time flies. But the opportunity that came in the spring of 1940 was a very real one. It was Germany's conquest of the Low Countries and of France. Nobody had expected that. That was not in the script. But for Japan, it was a godsend, because it meant that all of the European colonies in Asia were now unprotected. British Malaya and Singapore, French Indochina, and the biggest prize of all, the Dutch East Indies, lots of oil. And here Holland had been conquered, France had been conquered, Britain was hanging on by its fingernails that summer of 1940 in the Battle of Britain. Its colonies completely unprotected, and the Japanese said, well, they're ripe for the taking. All we have to do is seize this territory, and we solve a lot of our resource problems. And better yet, even better, if we take French Indochina, we can cut off China's supply lines to the west. We can literally starve China into submission. We can only alleviate our own resource problem. We can at last force China to surrender. So you can see why the Japanese would be so excited about this opportunity. But it wasn't all the Japanese who were excited. It was only the Imperial Army. We shouldn't be surprised by that. The Imperial Army, they were the ones over the barrel. They were the ones stuck in the Chinese quagmire. They were the ones most eager to pursue what they quickly labeled the southward advance. And if you take a look at your map, if you go due south from Japan, you hit the European colonies, French Indochina, British Malaya, Dutch East Indies. So we see the Imperial Army arguing vigorously for the southward advance. Let's just pick off these European colonies that are ripe for the taking. Nobody's protecting them. It'll solve all of our problems. The amazing thing is, though, is that the Imperial Navy says no. The Imperial Navy opposes a southward advance. Obvious question, why? Well, the Imperial Navy had not been a very happy military service for the past 3 years, because China, after all, did not have a navy. There was not very much for the Imperial Navy to do in the Sino-Japanese War, and they had found themselves starved of money. Their budget had been cut. The Army took the lion's share of it. Starved of resources. They didn't get as much oil as they thought they needed. They didn't get as much steel. And to build battleships and aircraft carriers, you need steel, and lots of it. And the Imperial Navy warned, all you Army guys, all you're doing in China is really angering the Americans. And when they do cut off our resources, we're the ones that are going to have to fight them. So we need the oil, your oil. We need your steel, the steel that you Army guys have been hogging. So unless you give it to us, we're not going to approve the southward advance. And here is where right of supreme command, that constitutional provision, became so crucial, because the Imperial Army and Imperial Navy cannot agree, and there is no president above them. There's no prime minister. There's no one to adjudicate this difference. And unlike inside the Army, the Navy's not about to allow Army officers with swords aboard any of their ships. Standoff. The Army had no choice but to agree to the Navy's extortion, and that's exactly what it was. The Army said, all right, we'll give you the oil, we'll give you the steel, you can commence a new naval construction program. That means we can't do the southward advance in 1940, and indeed Japan could not. The only thing that the Navy would allow was the Army to occupy the northern half of French Indochina, which was enough to cut off supplies into China, so it was giving the Army something. But as the Imperial Navy warned, the Japanese occupation of the northern half of French Indochina led immediately to the American government cutting off iron and steel scrap to Japan. Now, things were dire, and the Army said, well, to the Navy, come 1941, we're going to expect you guys to be ready. We're going to expect you guys to be ready for the southward advance because you've got your oil, you've got your steel, and we're not going to get much more because the Americans aren't shipping any of the iron or steel scrap to us any longer. Well, a deal's a deal, you would think, but come the spring of 1941, we find the same debate again. We find the Imperial Army on one side and the Imperial Navy on the other. What's rather interesting is they're on opposite sides. In 1941, it's the Imperial Navy that wants the southward advance immediately. It's the Imperial Army that vetoes the southward advance. Whatever could explain the shift, 180 degrees each one, in this? Well, if you look at the general war situation in the Second World War, it becomes very easy to explain. One part of the puzzle, the Navy part, actually has to do with the American reaction to the fall of France. As I say, that hadn't been in the script. Nobody had expected that. And what the United States does in the summer of 1940, right after France falls, is it raises its defense budget from $1.5 billion, this is back when $1.5 billion was a lot of money, to $10 billion. It does it virtually overnight. And part of that increase was a huge naval construction plan, which I actually have on one of these sheets of paper. So I can give you an idea of just how colossal the American construction program was. And naturally, it's the last one we take a look at. This is the American Navy construction plan of all new ships on top of the warships the United States Navy already has, passed just in the summer of 1940. 7 battleships, 18 aircraft carriers, 27 cruisers, 115 destroyers, 43 submarines. Folks, that's enough to be the largest Navy in the world from scratch. You know, if you start from zero. And the United States is not starting from zero. And the Imperial Japanese Navy says, this is aimed at us. We have a narrow window. It's going to take the Americans, even the Americans, a couple of years to build this stuff. So in 1941, we've still got a slight edge over them. In 1942, we still might have a slight edge. But come 1943, and these things start rolling off the launching bays, forget about it. We're not going to be able to do anything. So the Navy, for the Navy, the change is obvious. Right? We got our fuel, we got our oil, we got our steel, and the Americans are building like crazy, so we better strike while the iron is hot. So in the spring of 1941, it's the Imperial Navy pressing for the southward advance. Okay, so why does the Army, which was so eager for that just a year before, why have they changed their minds and now oppose a southward advance? That too has everything to do with the other part of the puzzle, not the United States, but the Soviet Union. Because in June of 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. And the Japanese Army is saying, this is an opportunity that comes along once every 10,000 years. We can now have a northward advance and attack the Soviet Union. Because everybody, and I mean everybody, knew that the Soviet Union could hold out for 6 weeks at most against the Germans. Frankly, Stalin thought that too, the day of Barbarossa. So the Imperial Army is saying, at long last, we can get rid of the Soviet menace that has hovered off our shores. We can take Siberia. We can make that Japanese territory. We can end the Russian/Soviet menace once and for all. We've got to attack northward. So no, we can't engage in the southward advance. Right of Supreme Command. What do you do when the Army and the Navy disagree? Well, the great irony of the resolution of this debate was that the man who resolved it, the man who in fact adjudicated between the Imperial Japanese Navy and Imperial Japanese Army, was a fellow called Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Because the Americans, when they figured out that the Japanese had compromised once again in 1941, and the Japanese Navy said, can you give us at least a little bit of the southward advance? And the Imperial Navy says, the Imperial Army said, well, since you let us occupy the northern half of French Indochina last year, we'll let you occupy the southern half of French Indochina this year, which was perfect for the Navy. That's a jumping off point that you're going to use to attack the French or the Dutch, or frankly, the American Philippine colonies. So the Imperial Navy was happy about that. What the Imperial Navy didn't know was that the Americans were reading their code and knew that Japan was about to occupy the southern half of French Indochina, and the Americans had assumed that it was preparatory to a grand southward advance. They didn't know about the impasse between the Army and the Navy inside Japan. They assumed the worst, which is a prudent thing to do. So, in the summer of 1941, the Americans cut off the oil. And now Japan really was in a fix. 6-month reserve. After that, nothing, which means neither the Army nor the Navy does a thing. You lose. Well, the Imperial Navy went back to the Imperial Army and said, how much oil is there in Siberia? Well, actually, as we know today, there was plenty, but not available in the technology of 1941. But there was plenty of oil in the Dutch East Indies. And so the Imperial Army had no choice but to agree to a southward advance, but not just any southward advance. The Imperial Navy didn't want a repeat of the Sino-Japanese War, which was mainly an Army affair. No, the Imperial Navy said, look, if we attack these European colonies, especially the British colonies, the Americans are sure to come into the war. So, to obtain maximum advantage, we're better off attacking the Americans as well as the Europeans right at the start of hostilities. Now, this requires a momentary detour into the internal debates inside the Imperial Navy, where we have one faction of the Imperial Navy that is a mainstream faction that says the southward advance, that's where the oil is, that's where we should go. But there was a maverick, a fellow called Yamamoto Isoroku, and he said, well, look, if we believe that if we attack the British colonies, the Americans will come into the war automatically, or to use the Japanese phrase translated, if we believe in Anglo-American indivisibility, then we shouldn't just attack the Philippines, because the Americans have only small fleet units there. We're not going to cripple them very much. No, what we really need to do is attack the main American naval base, and they've left their battleships so obligingly 3,000 miles closer than their usual base at San Diego. They're at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. So Yamamoto said, if we're going to have the southward advance, we've got to include not just the Philippines, we've got to include Pearl Harbor. And his superiors in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy General Staff, said, are you out of your mind? We have built our whole Navy around the premise of the southward advance. We have built our aircraft carriers deliberately to be short-legged so they can carry more aircraft. Short-legged means they have minimum range in that. We have never practiced refueling at sea, which we'd have to do multiple times in order to get our aircraft carriers into Hawaiian waters. Besides the fact that this is really risky. What if our carriers get spotted? The jig is up. This is risking everything that we've got. No, we won't agree to the Pearl Harbor attack plan. And Yamamoto said, well, in that case, I'll quit. I'll resign. Now, Yamamoto was commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, which meant he was the actual blue water admiral. But there was more to it than that. Yamamoto was a dedicated disciple of air power, naval air power in particular. He had trained, he was the godfather of the Japanese Naval Flying Corps. And all of his officers, in what is kind of an echo of feudal loyalty, said, well, if Yamamoto quits, we quit too. Well, this kind of thing wouldn't be tolerated in most militaries, but in the Japanese military, what choice did you have? The Naval General Staff said, okay. In that case, we'll go along with the Pearl Harbor attack plan. But Yamamoto had one further demand. There were two brand new Japanese aircraft carriers just coming off launch, just being constructed, not even maiden voyages, in September of 1941. September 1941. And Yamamoto said, I don't just want our 4 main fleet carriers that are tried and true, that have been through their sea trials, been through battle and so forth. I want the 2 new ones. Also, I want all 6 carriers. And the Imperial Navy General Staff said, you're crazy. Because if we do that, if we give you all 6 of our fleet carriers, we have to go to the Army and say, we're really happy that you agreed to the southward advance, but we are unable to provide any air cover for it. It's going to have to be an all-Army affair. We'll provide the ships to transport the Army troops, but all the air cover is going to have to come from Army planes and Army bases. And the Army officers were baffled by this. They said, you guys have 4 carriers and 2 more on the way. You've been begging us for the Southward Advance, and now we've agreed to it, and you're telling us that where the heck are your airplanes? The Army didn't know, but the Navy did, and so did Yamamoto. Those 6 carriers found themselves off Hawaiian waters on December 8th, Tokyo time, dateline. For Japan, it was December 8th. That was the day that lived in, well, not infamy for them. That was a day of triumph, and that's the story of the Japanese decisions that led us to Pearl Harbor. Thank you. I'm happy to entertain questions. Let's start all the way in the back, if I may.
You started off by saying that if there were a third world war, it would be started by policies taken in the United States. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, as with any historian or scholar outside history that spends their career studying American foreign relations, there are a number of alarming developments in the past few months. Chief among those alarming developments is the exceedingly narrow circle surrounding the chief executive of the United States. You can almost tell within the first few months of office how wise a president is going to be by one very simple test, and that is how broad does he draw expertise from, or she, if Hillary Clinton had been elected. Is it a very narrow circle of prior political acquaintances, which it has been far too often, and I say this not as a Republican or Democrat, both parties' leaders have been equally to blame in this regard. But if you take a look at the really great presidents, and I don't think there's too much dispute about who really great presidents are, I'll simply name 2, Franklin Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln. What distinguishes them is the breadth with which they seek advice. Roosevelt, in the summer of 1940, brings 2 Republicans into his cabinet. Can you imagine that today? Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, brings multiple Democrats into his cabinet. The chief Northern commanders in the Civil War are politically Democrats. One of them will run against Lincoln in 1864, George McClellan. Lincoln was unafraid to hear a wide range of advice. Roosevelt was unafraid to hear a wide range of advice. Now, part of it was because the nation was in dire crises for both presidents. But both presidents rose to the occasion. I'm deeply concerned that this president, like many ones in the past, had not listened to a lot of wide advice. And this president, who, give him credit, he understands Twitter. But there's a certain impulsiveness in the use of these kinds of things that can lead to decisions that cannot be taken back. And some of them might be indeed fateful decisions. So that's what I'm talking about. Yes, sir.
You had mentioned that we had broken the Japanese code, and we knew their intentions to go to southern Indochina. Why did we not know their intentions about Pearl Harbor?
Very good question, and I have a very good answer. At least I hope you find it so. The code, the Japanese used multiple codes, as any government will. The code that the Americans had completely broken was the Japanese diplomatic code. So we knew what the Japanese foreign minister was saying to any foreign embassy. Once the decision to occupy either half of French Indochina had been made, that decision had to be relayed to Japanese diplomats around the world, and the instant it was, the Americans were privy to it. They understood that perfectly well. The Japanese, for the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese foreign ministry had no connection to that whatsoever. There were codes, and of course, those were the codes of the Imperial Japanese Navy itself. It used several of them. The Americans were capable of reading about 3% of the Japanese naval codes. So they could get pieces of the puzzle. And I use that analogy quite deliberately, but they could only get pieces of the puzzle. What I tell my classes, because my students always want to know, hey, how come, wasn't Roosevelt SOB? Didn't he know that Pearl Harbor was coming? I use this analogy. I'm sure this generation is familiar with jigsaw puzzles. I hate to say it, but my college students are not. What's a jigsaw? Okay, well, you know what a jigsaw puzzle is, okay? You know, the really big jigsaw puzzles, I'm going to give you a really big one, 1,000 pieces, okay? How do you put a jigsaw puzzle together? How do you solve it? You got a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Somebody tell me how you solve it. Yeah, you start, because there's straight edges, right? So you build the edges, okay. Once you got the edges all built, what's the quickest way to start filling in after that? Colors, yeah. You sort into various colors. And doesn't everybody cheat when they put jigsaw puzzles together because, it comes in a box? And what's on the box? The picture of what you're going to end up doing. So, all the blues go up here and all the reds go down here. It makes it really easy to solve the puzzle. Now, what if I gave you a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and you can read 3% of the pieces? In other words, I'm going to give you 30 pieces of that jigsaw puzzle, and you have no box either. And none of the pieces have a straight edge. Right? How many of you think you could tell me what that jigsaw puzzle was? You got 30 out of 1,000. Right? The Americans had inklings. Right? They knew something was up from those 30 pieces. But they were not capable of putting it all together for the Pearl Harbor plan. Yes, sir.
Could you discuss the risk analysis that the Navy went through planning the attack, knowing that if it failed, they would have 6 carriers at risk, which eventually got demolished at Midway because of the failure of code security?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, the question is basically how crazy was the Imperial Japanese Navy in embarking on a Pearl Harbor attack plan that had a high degree of risk? Right? Don't you engage in risk analysis beforehand to figure out, well, what can go wrong and what can we do to minimize that risk? And the simple answer is, well, maybe not so simple of an answer, is that the risk analysis of the Imperial Navy in 1940 and 41 is primitive, to put it mildly. The place that you would look to discover that kind of capability is with the intelligence units of the Navy. And these were small. They were badly funded, and perhaps worst of all, they were where the officers went who couldn't make it anywhere else. Or to put it very bluntly, they were the dumbest of the Imperial Navy officers. The Japanese military, Navy and Army, the same thing is true on the Army side. The Imperial Army didn't have any better intelligence service than the Navy did. I don't know if it's samurai tradition or what it might be, but if you were the best and brightest, you went to the Japanese equivalent of West Point or Annapolis and the equivalent of the staff colleges, because the Japanese had them as well. If you excelled at either level of those, you were marked for operations. You were a combat officer. That's where the best and brightest went. If you couldn't quite hack that, you went into support operations like logistics, which incidentally is one reason why Japan was so slow and so bad at reacting to the American submarine campaign during the Second World War. If you were so stupid that you couldn't even handle logistics, you went into intelligence. And the Japanese pay for that time and time again. Not just they get lucky in the Pearl Harbor attack, but they are not so lucky, as you say, in Midway, and in numerous actions after that where they really are not just outshot by the Americans, they're outthought by the Americans, because the Americans, they've simply got better intelligence services at their command. So it's kind of a stupefying response, and it's one that I must confess, nobody believed when I gave a talk like this at the Naval War College up in Newport a few years ago. They just said, there's no military that can be that stupid. And I really had to bite my tongue, at that point, and said, well, take it from me, the Japanese were. Yes?
Could it possibly be because the Japanese had beat the Russians so badly in the war, the Russian-Japanese war in 1904, that they had like this super confidence that they could just about annihilate anybody?
Well, and they deserved it, didn't they? I mean, their operations, their naval operations officers said, well, hey, nobody else had beaten the white power before. We did.
They really destroyed it.
Yeah.
And the other, but what I don't understand is, I thought they signed, what was it called, a Triple Alliance or a Triple Entente, to keep the naval sizes down after World War I. They had an agreement, I guess, with America. How were they able to build these ships to increase the size of their navy without the intelligence from the other countries knowing that?
The agreement you're thinking of is the five-power treaty that was signed at the Washington Naval Conference in 1921, 1922. That indeed did cap tonnage or capital ships among the major power navies. What's not often understood is that treaty had a sunset provision. It was to expire in 10 years and did, and was renewed in 1931 for 5 more years, but with a provision that any power could opt out. They just had to give a year's notice. That's exactly what the Japanese do in 1934. They give notice. They also cheat a little bit, just to get into technical ends of it. Their heavy cruisers were, some of them were so heavy they capsized. Because heavy if you cap battleships, heavy cruisers the next class under, and the Japanese really overbuilt their heavy cruisers. I don't want to get into the details, but the Japanese openly abrogated it, and the Americans were completely free to build before 1940. They just don't until France falls. Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned the Japanese leader talking about the white power, beating the white power of the Russians. He did speak a little bit about how the Japanese were so different than the Germans in the eyes of the Americans. And was it racist?
Yes, it was racist. Yeah. That's really quite straightforward, and the evidence is really quite plain. I'll just give you one piece of it. In the aftermath of the First World War, as I said, Japan was on the winning side. It was on America's side by the end of the war. The Japanese went to the Paris Peace Conference, and they asked for one thing. They said, we don't care about all the territorial dispositions in Europe. That's not of interest to us. We're happy to join this new thing called the League of Nations. We'll be very pleased to do it. There's just one thing we want written into the Covenant of the League of Nations and the Versailles Peace Treaty, and that is a racial equality clause. We just want a simple statement in the treaty that all races of humankind are considered equal and alike. And the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George, said, "You gotta be kidding me. There's no way I'm agreeing to that." And the American President, Woodrow Wilson, said, "Over my dead body," well, he didn't use those exact words, but "over my dead body." And remember, look, Wilson was a Democrat. And in those days, the South was solidly Democratic. The white, solid South. Wilson, no Democrat, could afford to alienate that wing of the Democratic Party. Not that Wilson cared. Wilson brought back segregation, Jim Crow, to the White House. He was not about to agree to a racial equality clause. And the British, for their part, they had South Africa. We can't agree to this kind of thing. And the Japanese go home, no clause. It was never written in to the agreement.
And could you expand on that, looking at 2 atom bombs? What if they were white people in Japan?
Oh, if the atom bomb had been ready in time, it would have been used against Berlin. There is no question in my mind. None whatsoever. It turned out by the timing of the surrenders and the timing of the war, of course, that the Americans didn't have a device ready to use by the time Germany had surrendered, in which case it was kind of a moot point. But there was no doubt that a Western alliance that had engaged in Dresden, the firebombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Tokyo. Once you cross that line, the atomic bomb is not a big line to cross. More died in the Tokyo firebombing than died initially at Hiroshima. It's not an escalation of the conflict. And, you know, Dresden, I use Dresden deliberately because, of course, it was a German city. No, I don't think that played a very major role. The American public was very fond of the fact that it was the Japanese that got it dropped on them, but I don't think that played a role at the government level. Yes, sir.
Did the Japanese government, not the military, but Tojo, did he think that if Pearl Harbor was successful, the Americans would sue for peace?
That certainly was the hope. Yes, that was the
I thought it
hope.
was a possibility.
Yes, they thought it was a possibility, and it's not totally crazy in the context of December 1941. Let me walk you through the dominoes very rapidly. December of 1941, you could be standing in Red Square, Moscow, and you could hear the sound of gunfire. You know, the Germans were that close. Right? So here was the scenario that the Japanese hoped would be followed, and in fact the Japanese army, you know, why they pushed for the northward advance so much, they said, look, you know, okay, the Soviet Union didn't fall in 6 weeks, but 6 months, yes, it will. You know, by the start of 1942, the Soviet Union will have collapsed. The Soviet Union will have left the war. Germany will be free to divert all of its forces against the British, against any of the pressure points, the Suez Canal, Gibraltar, perhaps Britain itself. And they don't even have to defeat Britain physically. All they have to do at that point is drive Winston Churchill from power. And as soon as they do that, there will be a peace party, probably within the British Conservative Party itself, that will open negotiations, as indeed many British conservatives had suggested in the summer of 1940. You know, hey Hitler, you can keep Europe, just let us keep our empire. You know, we'll all live happily ever after. Well, if the Soviet Union falls, if Churchill's out of power and Britain sues for peace, is there much point to the United States continuing? That's what the Japanese hoped for.
If the atomic bombs were not dropped, would we have had to go in and fight on land in Japan?
Yes, no question about it. No doubt whatsoever. The shock of the atomic bombs, coupled with the shock of Soviet entry into the war against Japan, which actually occurs between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right at the same time. Those are critical events. The atomic bombs, because it convinces Emperor Hirohito that the Americans will stop at nothing to turn his country into ash. And the intervention of the Soviet Union means disaster for all the peace advocates in Japan that had hoped that the Soviet Union would be an intermediary, that they could approach the Soviets for eventual peace talks with the Americans. Well, once the Soviet Union's at war, there's no option but to approach the Americans directly if you went in hostilities. So those two shocks, the A-bombs and Soviet entry, really forced Hirohito to do something the Japanese emperor had not done in 800 years. And that is insist on a policy role and say, you're my army, you're my navy, I want you to stand down.
My understanding was that approximately the time that they when it came to Pearl Harbor, they were also going to Singapore and the Philippines.
Absolutely, that is correct.
How could they do that if all their aircraft carriers were at Pearl Harbor?
That's why the Army was supposed to supply the air power, and did.
But from what base? Where could they operate?
From Taiwan.
Taiwan.
Yeah. Luckily for Japan and unluckily for the West, the Army had this, and there was a naval version of it as well, this wonderful long-range fighter called the Zeke, also called the Zero fighter, that was not just agile, nimble, it also had exceptional range and made it possible for the Army to indeed supply air cover and air support for these landings. Now, having said that, I can't resist noting that the bulk of the Imperial Army's forces in December of 1941 were still in China fighting the Chinese, and the other great bulk were in Manchuria preparing the northward advance. The Imperial Army committed a grand total of 11 divisions to the attacks on European and American colonies. That is, Germany attacks the Soviet Union with over 300 divisions, to give you an idea of just what a shoestring operation the Imperial Army engaged in, but they pulled it off.
Yes, there was no, the Europeans were already busy, so they had no forces there.
The Europeans were busy, and it must be said the Europeans were, and not just Europeans, they were monumentally incompetent. The defense of Singapore was a first-class disaster, and the greatest disaster the British Army suffered in its history, and ever will. And don't get me started on MacArthur's defense of the Philippines. Yeah.
Did the demand for unconditional surrender effectively extend the war?
I think it did in some respects, because it gave the Japanese the opinion that the Americans would settle for no other terms. But I think I have to qualify that somewhat, because just to keep the chronology straight, Roosevelt makes the unconditional surrender pledge at Casablanca in January of 1943. And what's interesting is when Mussolini falls in Italy and General Badoglio creates a caretaker regime, the first thing Badoglio does is open negotiations with General Eisenhower. Well, that's not unconditional surrender. And in fact, Badoglio is allowed to remain in some aspects of power after British and American forces land in Italy. And the Japanese pay attention to that. They say, well, Roosevelt said unconditional surrender, but he allowed terms to the Italians. And that's exactly why when Truman, and once Roosevelt is dead, issues the Potsdam Declaration, right, the Japanese say, they come back and say, hey, we'll accept this, so long as you guarantee the integrity of the emperor. And they thought that was completely realistic because, hey, the Americans, they had done a deal with the Italians, maybe they'd do a deal with the Japanese. Yes, sir.
I was a Navy intelligence officer for 20 years, so I kind of understand what you're saying. But all through the 1930s, the Navy ran these massive war games called fleet problems. And my understanding is that I think it was the 1937 problem, fleet problem 19 or whatever it was actually a aircraft carrier simulated attack on Pearl Harbor, which the U.S. Navy pulled off with a great deal of success and demonstrated that it could be done. And I understand further that after the war, in Tokyo, one senior naval officer of ours was having dinner with a former Japanese admiral and said, how did you ever come up with the plan to attack Pearl Harbor? He said, easy, we copied yours. And I wondered if you'd ever heard that.
I have heard that. I have not found evidence of it in the Japanese archives, which is where historians are kind of trained to, to ferret out this kind of stuff. I have no doubt about the veracity of your report. I also would point out, though, that the United States Navy in the 1930s had war plans against Great Britain. Plan Red was the name of it. So we dare not take too much from taking a look at contingency planning. I mean, that's the kind of thing militaries do, and that's what they're supposed to do. So that, now to bring your point to the fore, so that they're not surprised by these sorts of things. And the American Navy, I mean, just to be fair, and the American government, to be fair, did expect something in December of 1941. They were just relatively certain it was going to be the southward advance. And in the great context of things, that was not a bad guess. I mean, they weren't completely off kilter to make that estimate. It just turned out to be wrong. Yes, sir.
I am from Italy, and I was in grade school when I was 1938. And the great thing that they always talked about at that time was about the Japanese ability to copy all the technology of the West and sell it very cheaply to the rest of the world. They were talking at that time that they could produce watches and sell them at 50 liras per pound. And they were working, and cameras, they were copying from the Germany and making cameras that were perfect and cost 1/10 of the German time. So at that time, they were talking in Europe, at least when I was in school, of the yellow period. The yellow danger was Japan, not China. It was exactly what we think about China now. They were producing very good stuff very cheaply. And so everybody thought that the enemy was Japan. So I was very surprised when the Italian became allied with the Japanese.
Yeah, what's always impressed me, frankly, and what we kind of skim over in this is, hey, folks, the Japanese, let alone watches and cameras, they could produce aircraft carriers. They could build fleet carriers that could hold their own with anything the West was capable of building. And to me, I mean, that's a magnificent accomplishment. You can't do that overnight. But the Japanese had done it. And I think, in some respects, they were not given the credit that they were due.
The counter thing is being a retired infantry officer. If they're studying war and they're studying other countries, you can bomb the heck out of people, and you can do all the Navy stuff you want and all the Air Force you want. But sooner or later, you got to be on the ground and get in there and seize it and hold it. Were there a follow-up plan for the Army itself to ever follow up the Navy action to get into Hawaii and actually hold the ground?
No.
No.
In fact, after this marvelous string of Japanese victories in 1941 and early 1942, the Japanese Navy says, well, we beat our own schedule. And there was serious debate over what should we do next? Should we invade Australia? Because if we do that, we might be able to force Churchill from power, all on our own. And there's nobody in our way. Or should we, finish off the American aircraft carriers because we didn't get them at Pearl Harbor? Let's get them this time. Just an array of possibilities. And of course, it was the Imperial Navy, so nobody could agree on which one that you wanted to do, which is why 2 carriers got sent to Coral Sea and 4 got sent to Midway, right? To the everlasting advantage of the Americans. But the ultimate holdout was the Imperial Army, because when the Imperial Navy said, we just need a few more Army troops so we can occupy Hawaii and lure the American carriers to their destruction, the Army said, no deal. You said we'd have all of our troops back for the northward advance in 1942. You're not getting a single trooper for this. Australia, forget about it, the Army said. There's no way. We want our forces back. And this is a debate, by the way, that goes on throughout 1942 when the American Marines land at Guadalcanal, right? The Imperial Army is saying, we don't want to reinforce Guadalcanal. We want to take what we got out of that area. And the Imperial Navy says, gee, maybe we need our own infantry. Like this.
What year did Japan form an alliance with Germany?
September 1940. Yes.
Can I ask one more current events question? What do you see as the most likely of the current crises that we're facing all over the world to lead to the terrible possibility that you mentioned?
North Korea, by far. I don't think there's any question about that. And I think Trump has no idea what he's dealing with, if I may be so bold.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Can you tell me what the former presidents Obama and Bush and Carter did that was so impressive about North Korea?
Actually, I could, but I can't do it in 10 or 15 minutes.
Is that right?
Yeah, it couldn't be done. But I'll be happy to, if you want to email me via Penny, I'll be happy to give you some readings about that.
Can you talk a little bit about answer
I
this
will.
one? Yeah.
Look, here's what I think is the worst case, but here's how I think it might spin out. The Americans do something, anything that spook the North Koreans, that really convince them that major American strikes are incoming. Okay? That's not a difficult scenario to imagine in the current environment. If you're North Korea, what do you do to strike back? Well, to me, it seems that just about everybody has got this wrong. They're not going to open up an artillery barrage against Seoul, South Korea. They're not going to try to fire off a nuclear missile to hit Tokyo. They've got something that is far deadlier and far quicker than nuclear missiles. It's called cyber warfare. The American power grid, folks, is completely unprotected. And I mean completely. When you get a virus in the system, it is designed not just, you can design it not just to shut down the system, you can design it to destroy the hardware of that system. The great turbines, you know, that power much of the United States, those things are mammoth. They take years to build. You can destroy them in 2 seconds with the right computer virus. You don't think North Korea has got those? And you don't think North Korea won't use them if it thinks its own survival is at stake? It will put the United States in the dark. I mean literally. And it will take years for the power grid to be restored. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think the United States could stand being in a nationwide blackout for a couple of years. I don't think that's a scenario I'd like to deal with.
Orville Schell and Henry Kissinger both wrote books on China, which were very interesting. And the premise is that China will do anything to defend its borders, which is why they came into Korea. Where does China really fall in the North Korea, South Korea, America, triad of interests?
China falls right in the middle, unfortunately for them and for the world. On the one hand, they'd really like North Korea to go away. It is a regime that is a thorn in their side. On the other, they're not willing to accept the reunification of Korea if that means what German reunification meant, the absorption of the North by the South. They're not willing to see what would amount to losing the Korean War for them all over again. So they're a bit stuck between a rock and a hard place because, what other options are there over the long term? Well, over the long term there aren't, but over the short and intermediate term there are, and that's a continuation of the status quo, which so far as the Chinese are concerned is the least of all evils for the moment. Well, thank you again. It's my pleasure.
Thank you all for coming. Start thinking of next year's topic. We will be as well. Before we all say goodnight, I just want to acknowledge that we have at least one, and I think that may be it, World War II veteran who has made his way here tonight, and it's John Holden. So John, please stand up. What some of you may not know is that we have been doing an oral history program here at the library for a number of years, and we have transcriptions and DVDs of quite a few interviews with World War II related interviews. If you have any interest in learning more about that, ask me and we'll point you in that direction. Meanwhile, I can't thank you enough, Michael, for such a fascinating talk tonight. Thank you all for coming.